Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about the third season of United States of Terror, the first half, 1 through 6. So, going into these first 6 episodes, immediately I'm like, wow, this story has really just fizzled out, to be brutally honest. Man, is this story really fizzled, to be brutally honest. It honestly seems like Kate doesn't even really truly have a story, or it seems that her story is so ridiculously flimsy, and I'm just in utter awe of just going into the fact like, man, I complained about Kate's stories before, but at least it seemed like the stories would actually have went somewhere. It seems that ultimately Max is non-existent throughout these 6 episodes. It seems that Marshall has, Max does have a story, but that story is the most irrelevant thing of this entire show, which is sad because ultimately it's butting heads with any number of any other stories that are kind of going on within this season. Basically, every single thing is taking a huge, gigantic backseat to Charmaine and Neil's having a baby, and everything else is just catering around that story. So reasonably, we have it to where there's barely like any real portion of anything going on, with the exclusion of um, us barely finding out things about Tara. Because reasonably, like, the whole journey of last season was to like solve mysteries and get clues together. Now Tara is just going to school this season. And reasonably I'm like, okay, so in other words, instead of figuring out and trying to solve Tara's mysteries with the help of her own therapist, which she has, instead we are just going and having her just going into school to have school adventures, to just like, there is so much about this season that just feels obvious that it's like a season to end the show. It's kind of blatantly obvious how it's really, you have a ton of people that have no direction, and it just feels like they ultimately weren't really trying to write this show whatsoever for this season. It just felt so flimsy to me and so falling apart that ultimately they just had to they had to have people do something, but uh, what that something isn't important enough. Like, everything feels like filler. Every single thing feels like filler, and like, it feels like killing time for this whole entire season. There's not a real, true, valued thing. It feels like they're adding people in just to add people into the show to ultimately just stretch out one long Charmaine and Neil story, and nothing is really and truly going anywhere. If anything, before the stuff happening in the first 2 seasons, yeah, a lot of points in time was probably stretching the story, but when looking at it, like, even the points in time where they were stretching things, at least reasonably, there was some action-packed moments, which ultimately I could be like, oh, well, that was interesting. Well, that was cool. Oh, okay, well, that was great that ultimately we went there. Now, in this one, I'm just kind of bored watching every episode. To be brutally honest, I'm getting bored. It's boring. Because there's nothing going on. It's basically just like, man, I can't wait for this show to be over kind of thing. And that's sad to say. So, anyways, let's get into it. So, ultimately, we have Tara, who is mixed with Dr. Hatteras, and recently that's her psychology teacher, which she is going to school for. We have it to where Max has only one story, and so ultimately I'll get to that in spoilers because he's doing nothing else. We have it to where Kate doesn't have a story, but ultimately what she does have is severely as if they had plucked and taken this out of any Family Guy episode or recently just any show of any kind where ultimately just like, yeah, just have her do this now, I guess. Because ultimately that story is so severely flimsy. Marshall has a severely flimsy thing to do, and so that's great for him. uh everybody besides the family and Charlotte and Neil basically is non-existent on this show. There isn't like an actual town like they were trying to do in season 2. In season 3 it just seems like we're back to, okay, let's cut as much money as possible on the casting budget and just have the fewest members of people that we can hire to be on this show, which is sad. So, anyways, let's go into ultimately just breaking it down, going into this, because there's nothing to really talk about, anyways. There's sadly nothing to talk about. I'm gonna just have to break it down in, like, just saying what everybody's doing this season, because the one true big story is just Charmaine and Neil, and that's it. That's really it. So ultimately, let's go into the double five timed thing. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm really just gonna have to break it down into really just like going, okay, well, this is what this person is doing through these 6 episodes, and ultimately where that story will be in line with every episode. I don't know. But ultimately, I'm just going to have to commingle within these 6 episodes. So, reasonably, for this one especially, if you haven't watched these first 6 episodes, but basically it's better to just go through these and watch these. I'm looking at it because I'm going to be all over the place with this review, with this spoiler time. I'm not going to go into every episode kind of fray. I'm just going to say what everyone does within these episodes and then ultimately just call it a day. Because these, whoa, man, what a piece of work these episodes really are. So let's ultimately go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So ultimately, we have it to where Max, I guess, has a story in these 6 episodes. Max ultimately has to forcibly sell uh, his construction job, which he wasn't really doing anyways, to a a company that ultimately he now is going to be like he's going to be involved in some lawn making company. So we ultimately have it to where Max ultimately sells his company and otherwise gives Neil $500, which ultimately Neil desperately wanted Max to continue doing this job, which ultimately they weren't really doing anyways. So that way Neil could keep making income, and now Neil is not making income, which ultimately is going to make Charmaine angry that Neil isn't making income. So that's pretty much basically all that Max is really doing. It seems that ultimately at some point we have Max complaining to his boss about some of the shortcuts that they're making in this job, or otherwise we have it to where Max is otherwise saying that he needs to put overtime in on certain jobs, and his boss is just like, no, just like cut corners to just kind of get it done. We have it to where Max is kind of just upset about what exactly he's doing because he's finding out that ultimately he is putting the wrong things on items, like he's putting poison on flowers and all kinds of other things, which ultimately he is not enjoying, he is not liking, and so ultimately he's just putting up with it so he can make money. So reasonably, that's all that's going on with Max. He has nothing to do with the story whatsoever, but okay, sure. Uh, Kate. Kate probably has more of a story than anyone else, but her story is so flimsy and all over the place. So Kate just ups and decides that ultimately, since she doesn't have a job or bizarrely a boyfriend now that this season 3 has started off at, We ultimately have it to where Kate otherwise just whimsically decides to just go over to Japan to ultimately teach people how to speak English. So we have it to where Kate ultimately goes to Japan, or is going to go on a flight to Japan, but then she finds out that ultimately the place of which that she was going to is having a horrible hurricane or weather issue. So Kate ends up going and saying like, well, how would I just fly to any place that ultimately you guys will be able to send me that is close as Japan as possible so I can teach people English. So we end up having Kate ending up flying to another portion of Japan, but then we have it to where Kate ends up going and regretting that decision because maybe she's going to land herself on the worst part of Japan. So we eventually have it to where Kate is back and forth doing this garbage that makes no sense. But then eventually we have it to where Kate ends up bizarrely meeting this flight attendant in this bathroom, and she's like, oh my god, this girl is so confident. And like, I think I absolutely need to absurdly be a flight attendant for some reason that makes no sense to me. So we end up having it to where Kate is ultimately to be a flight attendant, and she goes through all this training and things are going well for her, and eventually she meets a guy at this on this flight, and ultimately it seems that Kate is trying as much as possible to talk about uh, stuff from the flight and so on and so forth, yada yada yada. Really, it just seems that Kate is otherwise just having really nothing to do for these for these for these portions of time. We ultimately have it to where Kate eventually is to fall in fall for this guy on this plane, and then ultimately she's wondering how to figure out how to ask this guy out, and so ultimately she tries to, and the guy is like, well, no, like, I'm not really interested in you that way, and blah 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 blah. So we end up having Kate just going like, I have nothing to do for this season, as if I didn't have anything to do for this season anyways. Huzzah! So ultimately pushing on. So ultimately we have Marshall, who seems to be in over his head, because we end up having it to where Marshall ultimately is going with two other guys to make a film. Well, technically three other guys because school. So evidently, Marshall is doing a school project with a film thing, and so ultimately we have it to where, seemingly, his boyfriend ultimately that he had kept from last season isn't that great. We ultimately have it to where seemingly him and his boyfriend are experimenting and ending up with some other guy uh, during this season. We ultimately have it to where Marshall ends up breaking up with, I think his name is Lionel, the guy with the blonde hair. Ultimately to end up with this long-haired boy that ultimately he is doing a movie with. Because ultimately at first they were going to try to do some action, old-fashioned movie that looked really, really cool, but when looking at it, I guess they were going with another direction. And we have it to where Marshall instead decides to try and do something that is to showcase his family and all the problems that they have with it. And so ultimately we have it to where they're going through old home videos and stuff like that. We have it to where Max is otherwise kind of telling some things about his past to Marshall, about some of those old videos that they had done and so on and so forth, to have context. And so ultimately, like, Marshall is trying to do a video about his mother and how his mother is basically cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. So ultimately, so now that we've kind of done everybody in this family, because that's all that really matters, we ultimately have Tara, and then we'll get to Charmaine and Neil, which basically is the big story through these 6 episodes. So Tara is going back to school to prove to Dad that she's not a fool. I don't know. If you guys remember the movie Billy Madison, huzzah for you. So we ultimately have it to where Tara is going back to school because she has nothing better to do, and she really doesn't. She's like basically like, well, I have no mysteries to solve, so I guess I'll just go back to school because she is a couple of credits short to graduating. So we end up having Tara going back to school to ultimately end up seemingly finding her way into a psychology class with Dr. Hataras. And so ultimately we have it to where Tara ends up going and altering within this class, ultimately at some point being uh, her therapist self, and ultimately just going and taking Dr. Hataras's. I'm just gonna call him Doctor. I'm. She takes her doctor's class hostage and ultimately just starts going on to this rampage about all these other stuff. And the doctor ultimately says, like, go on. Like, yeah, evidently you're taking care of my class. Sure, all right. Like, so we ultimately have it to where the doctor ends up taking and making an example of Tara, ultimately to the point of uh, going in and taking this entire class and really focusing on DID and the disorder of which that Tara has. Ultimately, really, to at some point making Tara just kind of humiliated by the teacher focusing on this so much. We ultimately have it to where Tara ends up talking to the doctor and whatever, and we have it to where the doctor doesn't believe in DID or anything like that. Ultimately, it seems like he is trying to disprove a lot of things and so on and so forth. Ba 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 ba. Because it doesn't matter. There's not enough here to really like grab at this apple and go, yeah, what a good story. So we end up having it to where bizarrely, we have it to where Tara is desperately asking for an extension on her exam, and the doctor won't give it to her. And so we ultimately have it to where Tara is ending up almost going into like very just utter exhausting like measures trying to study but not having the ability to study. So we end up having it to where Max ends up telling one of his friends that ultimately it's like, yeah, like I don't like that she had gone back to school because I remember hearing before that ultimately Tara had almost killed herself because of how stressful her studies were. And so we end up having it to where Tara almost takes a like a knife or something to her wrist, but we end up having all the other alters telling her no, don't do that. We end up having it to where ultimately the alters end up trying to help her with her studies, and so we end up having it to where ultimately it seems that Tara eventually finally comes and puts her foot down and ultimately says, you know what? Like, I am completely and otherwise nullifying this whole United States of Terra thing. I am going to make it so that ultimately Terra is king and all the altars have to do everything that I say, kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where every single one of the altars in Terra's brain has to acknowledge that they are going to have to they are going to have to do whatever Terra says. So we end up having we end up having it to where ultimately Terra is at her exam, ultimately having her notes basically all be every single one of these alters agreeing to this whole thing, and we eventually have the doctor witnessing this. And so eventually we have it to where the doctor ends up putting these crazy scrambles of whatever Tara was doing all into an actual contract of sorts, to where the doctor says like, oh, okay, yeah, it's like every one of these personalities had to agree to this and this and this and so on and so forth. We have it to where the doctor wants to take advantage of Tara and wants to study her and ultimately do an entire class about her kind of thing. And so ultimately we have it to where seemingly maybe Tara is going to get some answers out of this, because we ultimately end up having the doctor mention that had done a examination on a student before, that ultimately all he would do was stay at home, because if he thought that he went outside, ultimately he thought he would be sucked out of the atmosphere, kind of like gravity wise, how like all of a sudden like this person would be able to just float away like a kite kind of thing. And ultimately he is not a kite, he is just a normal person. So that is kind of what is really just overall just going on with Tara within the show. And so now we have to get into the Neil Charmaine thing, because recently that's the big bulk of what is really to go on. So ultimately we have it to where Charmaine and Neil has had a baby. And so ultimately this baby is ultimately called Cassandra Wheels something or other. I don't remember what the last name was. So we end up having it bizarrely that the kid doesn't really go by Cassandra. It consistently goes by Wheels. So we end up having it to where ultimately, because ultimately there had been some time between Charmaine's pregnancy from the end of season 2 to season 3. I think they had taken 2 months in between from the end of season 2. So now they're kind of doing the Walking Dead thing, where it's just like, let's just have some time elapse, because who cares anyways? Let's just, because ultimately the main focus is this baby story. So they basically had to write this season for this baby coming, and that is the weirdest thing ever. Ultimately, I'm just wondering if Charmaine, the actress, actually just had a baby anyway, so they just kind of wrote in like this baby for realsies. So going into this show, so we ultimately have it to where Neil and Charmaine are ultimately, after the baby is to come out, they're repetitiously just having bedroom business with one another, even if it's on a piano. So ultimately they're having sex quite frequently, because baby is out, and plus without a doubt it's basically to the point where like Neil is trying to make Charmaine happy, and ultimately because Charmaine is just really hard to make happy because she's Charmaine. So going on into this, we because what ends up happening is T ends up causing the birth of their child, of Neil and Charmaine's child, basically. Because we have it to where ultimately while Tara and Charmaine are at a grocery store, we end up having it to where Charmaine ends up turning into T, and then ultimately she ends up trying to steal some beer, and we end up having Charmaine to desperately tell T to turn back into Tara, and Tara is ultimately desperately trying to get out of here and try to escape, and Charmaine will let her because ultimately, like, hey, I need a ride. So we end up having it to where Tara ends up backing away into another car, hitting her, and so ultimately we have it to where Charmaine's water broke, ultimately to forcibly have her go into early labor and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where Charmaine desperately is to go into labor, but Neil isn't exactly present, and so we end up having it to where I believe Ted ends up driving her to the hospital to deliver said baby, and so on and so forth. Because ultimately it seemed that Ted wasn't, Ted not being at this home is probably the worst possible thing, and so ultimately, or Neil not being at home is the worst possible thing, because ultimately we have it to where Charmaine and Kate are living together, and Neil is consistently asking, "Well, can I live here too? Can I like you're going to have a baby soon, and I'm not going to be able to be there to know exactly when the baby is coming." So we end up having it to her forcibly. Neil is sleeping over, and so ultimately we have it to where baby's delivered, and huzzah, huzzah. And so we end up having it to where reasonably, like within this time, we have it to where ultimately uh, Charmaine and Neil are having difficulties with this baby, to where Tara is consistently giving them information to help them figure things out. We ultimately have it to where Tara is changing as Alice, to ultimately giving them to tell them like, hey, if you just turned a vacuum on, then ultimately she would be she would be completely fine, and ultimately she wouldn't be crying anymore. We have it to where also there's some points in time where ultimately Tara is thinking that the baby might have choleric or whatever, and we have it to where ultimately because Neil is just calling Tara just like help, like she won't stop crying. So ultimately we have it to where Tara ends up going and desperately trying to help them by telling them what exactly to do, and so they eventually do it and things work. Ultimately, with Tara watching at the other end of her backyard, watching them. So we end up having it to where Tara is a good guidance person to help Charmaine out, but Charmaine is just stubbornly just going like, well, I don't want you anywhere near my baby because you're unsafe. What happens if ultimately you become Buck and Buck chucks the baby, or what if you become whoever else and like they leave my baby unattended or whatever. But Tara has a real good bottleneck of these altars that ultimately like Tara is saying like hey, I'm gonna be there for you, like, and Buck won't do that kind of thing, and so on and so forth. And so because we ultimately have like some point where ultimately there's an annoyance of crows, and so ultimately Tara turns into Buck just so Buck could kill this crow, and then ultimately Buck turns right back into Tara because Tara asks Buck to just go back into her, and ultimately she does. So we have it to a reasonably. Like I was kind of happy that we had T in this season again, but when looking at it, like her time here is so brief, and then ultimately, like when she's actually here, like she just kind of like, oh, like T looks a little goofy this season. Like if either she's not exactly T because ultimately she can't like Tara is T for what it looks like, or recently when we do have Tara, it just feels like they're ultimately just kind of like going through the motions of just like, well, we're not gonna go full on T, we're just gonna just have it just be as close as budget would allow. So we end up having it to a reasonably, and they're, man, are they cutting the budget of this show? It's ridiculous. So we end up having it to a reasonably. Charmaine is to ultimately have it to where she can accept Tara holding her baby, and that's a great moment. We ultimately have it to where there's no real true mysteries to be solved in this season. We ultimately have it to where Neil ends up getting Charmaine's mother into the mix of seeing Charmaine's child. Because we ultimately have it to where Charmaine had mentioned, like, man, I don't even realize that I had come from an abusive family and stuff along those lines, which ultimately they're not really, I guess, solving any of that stuff. So we end up having it to where ultimately Tara and Charmaine's mother comes into the fray to see Charmaine's baby, all while really just forking over some dough to with just baby stuff. Ultimately, having it to where ultimately Charmaine's mother is going and buying all kinds of things for the baby so that way she can spend more time with the baby. And so ultimately we find out that it seems that reasonably Charmaine's mother is starting to run out of money. Because ultimately we find out that they had to put her father away into some medical hospital to take care of him. So in other words, they really tried to write this actor out because ultimately they didn't know what to do with him. So they just figure, oh, just put him in some hospital. That'll write him out. Because ultimately, when looking at it, it seems that uh, like every little bit of things that they did in the previous season, where it's like Charmaine's mom had to have red hair. Like I think now, since the season has come to close, I bet the mom was like, "Dude, I'm not gonna dye my hair red again." Like, no, I'm just gonna have my hair blonde. And ultimately, they're just like, "Okay, fine." Because ultimately, she's probably tired of consistently coming in there and have to re-dye her hair every time she comes into the show. So we end up finding out that recently Neil and Charmaine finds out that ultimately they don't have any money anymore. Like Charmaine's mother doesn't have any money. It's like if anything, she's kind of spending what little left of what she has to ultimately just see this baby and so on and so forth, and let Charmaine know that ultimately her dad is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. So ultimately, recently that's just the real tail end of most of this story. I know there's probably a lot to probably more go into and dive into, but recently I think that's really just all the important stuff of this first half of the third season. So, anyways, yeah, I think that's simple enough to really just get out of here and just ultimately just I can't wait for more episodes of Charmaine and her baby adventures because I'm sure that's all what's going on in between that or Tara going back to school. And yeah, just 6 episodes, and we're just gonna be done with this season. Which ultimately, I'm just like, yeah, that's like if anything, a lot of the other shows that I've watched have had a lot more going on with a lot of nothing. Like looking at this one, looking at this show compared to like a The Last Man on Earth. Like ultimately, that show has like nothing going on, but there's so much going on. Where this show has like nothing going on, and ultimately they're just kind of like it really just is to the point of like us knowing why that this show like wasn't going to get picked up even when like because I think that this show was ultimately just like wasn't the thing that it was supposed to be from the get-go, and so it just seemed like this show was trying as much as possible to see what it could get away with for however long. um like I don't feel like there was any real true like cementing of any number of these things for this show. It was basically just like, well, hey, like we had it to where Steven Spielberg was producing this show, and ultimately, I guess that kind of sealed the deal on putting this show together. But man, were these stories of everyone just like really like awful. Um, when really looking at it, I was like, man, watching like Atypical, where every single season, like it would get really, really good, and when looking at it, I'm like, Marshall, the guy that plays Marshall in the show, came did that show, and ultimately looking at it, like, how is it that they, how is it that they did, how is it that they wrote so well for that show that ultimately feels quasi like the same thing, but when doing this show, like I think there was people that didn't know how to write this show from day one, and so ultimately they were just seeing how long they can get away with writing a show that they didn't really know anything about, and now that they have to get somewhere because this show is just finishing up, like yeah, it's like writing around the fact that ultimately a person doesn't know anything about this disorder, and so they're just trying to mask it by like having other people besides Tara be on the show to hide things for longer. And now that this show is ending, like, I can understand why it ended, because reasonably there was no real true, like, anybody who is any legitimate person could have figured it out. It's like, yeah, like, this isn't going into anything about this disorder, and it's just kind of like a lot of generic things that ultimately aren't quite legitimate. And when looking at it, I think that's why this show failed so much, or why this show failed and only lasted this long, because it was ultimately like, when looking at this compared to like a Dexter, where ultimately you have it to where, um, like, that show is always going into one smooth momentum. Like, looking at this show, this had a lot of starts and stops for everyone, and so I think that's another reason why ultimately, like, this show suffered the way it did, was just because nothing worked well for anybody. So ultimately, they just kept having to just start and stop every single person's character, and so ultimately, with that way of approach of doing a show, it's just no wonder why it didn't last for long. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.